everyone. I hope that you had a great break. You're refreshed. You are alert. You are ready for this closing panel. We are exactly 45 minutes away from happy hour if you are on the East Coast or the West Coast. No judgment here. You do you, but we're almost there. We've got a great panel for you, so I'm excited to get into it. This panel is titled HR as Catalysts for Cultural Change. And no more of me talking. You've had enough of that today, so let's get into it. I'm joined by some really amazing and accomplished panelists. Let me introduce them each quickly, and then we'll get right to the meat of it. So, panelist number one is Stéphane Charbonnier, Chief Human Resources Officer for L'Oreal USA. Sonia Eccles, Vice President of Human Resources for Comcast. And Adam Galinsky, Professor of Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School and author of the book Friend and Foe. So glad to have you all here. Sonia, I'm going to start with you. You get to kick us off. Let's build some context. We're here to talk about culture change, and so how does your organization think about culture? And I'm curious how the past year has impacted culture at Comcast.
Well, thank you so much for starting with me and putting me on the hot seat first. I always enjoy that. So to answer the question, at Comcast, we really think about culture from the perspective of norms, right? So defined and accepted behaviors, interactions and practices, and those systems that we have in place to either support those practices or, basically taking a step further and making sure that we are able to reinforce those practices with those systems. So that's kind of how we think about culture. This past year has been a challenge for us in the sense that COVID kind of blew up our culture because our culture was really based on being together in multiple hubs, locations, et cetera. And so we've had to split up our workforce. We have a certain segment of the workforce that has to be out in customers' homes, in our retail locations, and then we have the support functions who were able to work from home. And so we have had to meld, so to speak, two separate cultures into one. And so that has its own challenges, but it's been successful thus far, knock on wood.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Stéphane, same question to you. Talk to us about how you think about culture at L'Oreal and what the past year has done to your culture.
So thanks, Jason. And I'm going to echo actually what Sonia talked about a little bit for L'Oreal. At L'Oreal, we've been, the company existed for now over 112 years, and we only had 6 CEO, and we announced actually the number 6 last week. So culture is something that is built around continuity, built around values of things that are visible to the public and to the people in the organization, but something as well that are not visible, that are truly values, beliefs, and things that are I would say implicit. So that's what we're built on, and a little bit like Sonia at Comcast, our culture is a culture of being together because we innovate together, because the beauty industry requires people to test products as well and texture. But I want to also, we saw some silver lining when it comes to accelerating a hybrid model that we could feel coming up in the past years. And certainly that has challenged us, and I'll be happy when it has really challenged us to be much more innovative and using and leveraging virtual reality to be much more explicit for, in particular, new joiners regarding our culture. So I'll leave it there, but that's for us.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, Adam, before I come to you, I want to ping everyone that's listening right now. Two things. One, right next to us is the QR code. We figured out now a QR code means there's a poll. And so if you would, grab the trusty device, scan that QR code, and respond to that poll, if you would, in the next few minutes, because we'd love to get your feedback and draw you in. We would also love for you to participate with us in this conversation. I have some questions teed up that we're going to talk about here, but we want you to drive this conversation where you need it to go as the audience. So please use the Ask Speaker a Question to get questions directly to us, or drop it in the discussion. We'll find it and we'll get to it. So engage with us. Now, Adam, I'm coming back to you. Conversation today is about how HR can be a catalyst to culture change, but I think we need to call out the elephant in the room first, which is any of us that have been in the culture change business or have tried to do culture change would probably argue that, making change and sustainable change in culture is hard work. Why is it so challenging to change culture within an organization?
It's a great question. And let's just start off with, it's not just hard in an organization, it's hard even at the individual level. Like every species in the world, right, is created, evolved by design to be a creature of habit and routine. And so any change is scary because it pushes us off our security blanket of familiarity and puts us in these open seas of uncertainty. Cultural change in particular, though, is especially difficult for a couple of reasons. First is we often try to develop what are called strong cultures. So take the example like L'Oreal, with 6 CEOs and the word continuity, right? This idea that it's a strong culture. Now, what do we mean by strong culture? Well, there's a consistency and there's also an intensity. And strong cultures are amazing, right? They have all these benefits. Economists and sociologists have documented how the strength of a culture predicts firm performance and is really essential. The second reason why culture change is difficult, even beyond this human and even cross-species tendencies to resist change, is also that culture operates a lot of times at a very implicit level, right? These cascading sets of behavioral expectations that sometimes are not always articulated. So Sonia used the word defined practices, right? But sometimes it's defined, but even at this sort of implicit level. And then the third thing is that we want to always socialize people into our culture. So we bring people in and we set up these systems of socialization, which then now they're kind of trapped, right? Which puts them in that's their habit and that's their routine, right? So therefore, changing a strong culture requires a few things. It requires a consistent effort. Right, a strong culture is itself consistent, but you have to have this consistent effort that has to then pervade every element of an organization. And then it also requires making these implicit assumptions and expectations really explicit, right? And so kind of is almost like reopening, right, the body and looking inside. So what I always tell people, like, before you even think about culture change, is you have to understand, what is the culture today? What are we going to change? What is changing? So you have to start with this cultural audit from the very beginning, and then we can start to go through what are the ways that we can actually make this very difficult process a little bit easier, a little bit more sustainable, and a little bit more implementable.
Stefan, I see you, there's a lot of nodding going on. So I'm assuming this connects to your experience in confronting this directly, I assume.
It does, and when I'm listening to Adam about implicit and what's difficult, we all know that one of the most difficult changes is changing human behavior, and certainly in my experiences, people get on board very easily, I want to say, with the what and the why. But what's getting in the way for the people who wants to change, because of course we have people that are always reluctant, like in any change. You have the early adopters, but most of the people, they struggle with the how. So I think guiding them on how you deal with the how, and not only, and I want to say, mitigating the rational part of the change with the emotional part of the change, and acknowledging that and sort of supporting it is extremely important in my experience.
And I just want to add just one really important thing about that, right? Is that, we're kind of, created as human beings to resist change, but part of this is this idea of loss aversion. Like Nobel Prizes in economics have basically been won by saying that humans are more sensitive to what they might lose. And so culture change has within it an element. If the culture changes, will I lose my standing? Will I lose my resources? Will I lose X? And so there needs to be, I think, two things that are really essential at this emotional level. The first is to reassure people to the extent that they're not going to lose anything. Now, sometimes that might not be true. They may actually will lose something, but to at least create that as, if you can reassure them, that's great. And the second thing is exactly what Stefan said, which is that to acknowledge that the leaders can say, look, it's difficult for me too. Like, I know this is difficult for everyone, and so to acknowledge that people, what I found in my research is that when leaders acknowledge the emotions and expressions that other people are experiencing and say that they are also experiencing that tends to dissipate those strong feelings and anxieties because they recognize they're shared and not just isolated within oneself or one group or one division.
Sonia, does this resonate for you? Are there any other challenges that stick out for you that we haven't talked about?
So everything that both Adam and Stefan said definitely resonates. The one thing that I want to just throw out to both the panel and the folks who are joining us is that, to me, it all starts with changing behaviors and, the reluctancy for folks to change certain aspects of a culture is around their beliefs and experiences. And so if we can focus on the behaviors first and provide new experiences for folks, that bridges the gap to the belief section, right? And so then those beliefs then drive values, right, in the organization. And then the values drive the systems that we have in place. So once we start with the behavior aspect, and getting folks to just, I know everyone hates saying it, go through the motions, right? And then things will start to kick in. They'll see, oh, well, I didn't have a reason to be afraid of what I was losing. Look at all that I've gained. Or, hey, I didn't know that we could do things differently this way. And so once that happens, you will get the buy-in. But I do think that focusing on changing the behavior first helps really get that ball rolling.
When I don't, one of the really practical barriers that I've run into in my work as well with clients and even in my time in HR is that, even piggybacking on what Adam said, and I think then what you've built on is, starts by understanding where you are, and then they're sort of defining where you're going. And guess what? Defining this stuff is really hard, and it takes time, and it's not easy or fun. And I think leaders just often don't want to do that work because you've got to slow down in order to do it. And so it's at least I found it to be really hard to draw the leaders into that work unless they're really motivated to do so as well. I'd love to see the results of our poll if we could, to see what kind of challenges we've got here. So let me see if I can get this big enough that my eyes can read it. I don't know that I can. Well, let's see. I honestly cannot read it. My eyes are too small. So we're just going to take it on. Maybe Bella or one of our awesome magical teammates in the background could drop the results into the chat for us so we could see it. But the audience now knows what the results are, which is a fantastic thing. So let me come back to our next question. I think this is where I want to convert into, we've talked about culture change and why it's hard and some of the challenges and some of what we need to do. And let's pivot now to the role that HR can play. And I think we titled this How HR Can Be a Catalyst, but I don't think that does HR justice. I think HR can be a leader of cultural change. And so, Sonia, can you talk to us about an example of where you and your team have led the way on a specific culture change at Comcast and kind of what that looked like?
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about COVID. So I will pivot away from COVID. We're doing some really great things at Comcast in HR right now. And one of the things that we're focused on is making sure that we're creating space for our HR business partners to be more strategic in their roles. And so we are pivoting away from having our HR business partners do all of the transactional work, all of those things. And so it required and will continue to require a culture change within the organization. Because everyone has always been used to going to their HR business partners for everything. And now we're saying, okay, well, this other work is being put and being centralized into center of excellences, right? So those kinds of things. And then we're going to focus on the activities that give the organization the most return on their investment. And so that has been, continues to be a huge culture shift for us. One of the ways that, we've been able to really move the needle on this change is by really getting buy-in from influencers throughout the organization. And so really bringing people along with you on the journey is really important. And also getting feedback from the folks that you are supporting throughout the organization, asking their opinions on maybe some of the things maybe that we missed, but really getting folks involved so they feel like they are a part of the solution is really, really important. And I think that's why we've been successful thus far. We still have some additional things that we need to do and put in place. Again, but we are bringing folks along in the business with us.
Two quick tactical questions on that. How do you identify who your influencers are?
So that's a great question. As HR, I do think that we do have quite a bit of influence, and it's always great if you also get other folks in the boat with you, so to speak, so that you don't have to work as hard. And so there are always people in every organization that has the ear of the major decision makers. And really knowing the folks in your organization, you will be able to identify who those folks are and make sure that you have them in the room when you're making those decisions so that they can help get folks on board.
And then when you mentioned a little bit about like getting feedback from them, are there other like specific tactics you use when you are approaching those influencers to kind of bring them get them on board with this or bring them in the bus?
Absolutely. Once we figured out where we wanted to go as an HR team, it was really about one-on-one meetings with certain decision makers, focus groups, giving folks previews about where our head was around the changes or the changes that we really wanted to make, and making sure that everything's not a big secret. First of all, making sure that they understand that the change and the impact it's going to have on how they do their day-to-day work, that we're being really, really thoughtful. And so when folks know that you have that in mind when you're designing all of these org changes and the way that we do business and all of that, the operational models, it's easier.
Awesome. Stefan, same question to you. Can you take us through a culture change initiative led from HR on your end?
Sure. A couple of years ago, the group went through a very thorough and large digital transformation that really our industry faced. And we defined at that time that to really be successful in our business transformation, we needed to go through a cultural transformation. So we defined at that time what was the sort of promised land, that's what we called it at that time, and we defined our change journey as, we're going to cross the desert. And there are multiple ways to do that. We'll go through change fatigue and so forth, but there will be some milestones along the way. And one of them was to create, to be successful, a culture of feedback internally, because this was part of our poll survey we got. It was a sort of an obstacle to move along that journey. So we really defined and worked with the leaders on what does that mean, culture of feedback, in terms of the rituals in terms of, starting with the leaders. And we worked, and a little bit like Sonia talked about influencers, we actually set up a network of what we call our champions. And we have over 30 champions throughout the US organizations. In every single team, we have multiple, and the way we picked them was their ability to speak up and be comfortable and challenge as well the leaders on and hold them accountable by sharing what they're seeing. And the way we animate that group of champions, it's first of all it's co-owned by HR and by the CEO, so that makes a very strong sort of point around the importance and visibility of them. And we have monthly touch points, and our CEO comes every quarter. So we held that group accountable as for what's going on. And to an earlier point that Sonia was making in her introduction, defining culture, we've also aligned our rewards to make sure that we were going to celebrate, but also, potentially ding the behaviors that we didn't want to see. So, there's a part of our bonus, of leadership bonus, that is based on feedback. Am I a leader that is fostering a culture of feedback? Am I asking feedback? Am I giving feedback to employees? So this is something that we've been working at for many years. And I wouldn't say we're done, because you're never done in a transformation journey, and we still have a lot to do. And as my experience, as I'm sure Sonia's and Adam as well, is the more you do, the more expectation you create, which is great. So that's the example I would want to share.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'm sure there might be some questions that'll come our way from either one of those. I want to zoom back a little bit, Adam, to come to you based on sort of your broader research and work with clients to maybe pivot us into some broad advice as to, because I think probably most people on the other end of this are looking at some kind of culture change that's needed. And so can you give us some advice on how HR can effectively shape this? What kinds of things should we be doing or thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And I want to just comment on two of the things that were mentioned as sort of the biggest barriers to change. One was competing demands for time was the #1 listed concern, and #2 was leadership buy-in. And I think both those come together with something which I'm a huge believer of, are the value of retreats, the value of taking people out of their daily time and space to reflect. And I thought Sonia said something really important. How do we help people become better strategic thinkers, right? Well, we know that strategic thinking requires a little bit of stepping back and seeing the big picture, and sometimes going around that. So earlier I mentioned step one has to be a cultural audit of what is our culture today, right? And sometimes that can be really done in this retreat. Step two is, where do we want our culture to be tomorrow? And so then we can, if we have the audit, we can compare where it is, where we want it to go, and start thinking about all of those situations. So you can almost think of two retreats, essentially, one for the audit, one for the, where are we going? And I think that's really important. So the reason why I emphasize that is that the leaders are demonstrating their buy-in, and they're understanding the competing demands for time when they allow for retreats, right? It solves those two central problems. It's the signal that this matters, and we're giving you the time and space to do it. I have a phrase that I like to do. It's sort of the V. So if you want to get to victory with change, you got to have values, voice, and vision. And what I mean by that, and I think, L'Oreal would be, I think, a great example of that, also Comcast, is, take a step back and said, what are the core values that matter? And those values may be the same regardless of whether the culture is changing or not. But the reason why that matters is because those values can be used to animate everything else that follows. It gives it that ballast. Now, the second thing is voice. And I think Sonia brought that up really well. This idea of making sure that, she mentioned the idea of focus groups, right? Focus groups are, I think, really, getting to this point where you can really hear it. Now, this is where I see the biggest problem with focus groups, is they happen too late in the process. They happen when the train's already left the station. Because people always ask, where's my voice? And they want to see their voice earlier on in the process. Now, there's a huge benefit for getting voice early on in the process, which is when you're later articulating your values and you're articulating the new culture, you can actually directly connect it to some of the voices you heard along the way. There's nothing more powerful than if someone to say, you know, as Sonia said in one of our focus groups, you know, this, and this is why we're doing X, right? That it just shows to the whole organization that your voice matters. Now, the other thing that Sonia said, which I think is also so important, is this idea of behaviors and practices, right? And I think the second thing that you have to do is once you have those values and once you have that voice, you have to develop a system of behaviors and practices that implement those values and those voices. And the final thing, and I have the word vision, and I'm using it probably in a slightly different way because some people kind of conflate it with values, is here's the thing I see the biggest problem always over and over again, which is people do a great job with the values. They really listen. They come up with this amazing system, and then they don't communicate it effectively. So one of the most important things is once the system's in place, you have to communicate it. In terms of the values and in terms of those voices, you need to provide a coherent explanation for why we're going, why is this practice in place? What is this practice doing, right? And then the final thing is all along the way, right? Having that right touch of between being candid, right? This really matters, right? This is critical, but also being sensitive. It's scary and we get it, right? And so understanding that, you know, all along the way. I was funny when we were talking, I was thinking of this, it dates how old I am, but like, you know, the Karate Kid where he's doing, you know, painting and waxing, but there's all for a purpose. And so sometimes we can put in those behaviors, but we have to remember to eventually integrate those behaviors and explain how they come together to produce that new culture.
I think you're okay, Adam. I mean, Karate Kid is cool again, man. I don't know if you know that, but Cobra Kai, it's all cool again. I think you're good. You're covered. So, no, that is. I think that's great, and it's helpful to have that. You know, have a framework like that to operate from. I'll come back to you, Sonia, to build on that from your experience as you think about those things. What advice would you add on to that for someone that's thinking about or approaching? You know, how do you apply that? And I'm specifically interested in the engagement of employees, the timing of the engagement of employees, to Adam's point about the focus groups and when do you bring them in and how do you bring them in when you're trying to initiate culture change?
Absolutely. So I think to build upon what Adam said, the first thing I want to just dive in on is around values, because everyone talks about values. Most organizations have them written down, but are they really the values of the organization? Because the values of the true values, again, you have systems that reinforce and support those things. And usually they're measured, right? So, and so the things that really matter are measured. And so if you have a bunch of values on a piece of paper, but we're not really putting in systems to reinforce and support those really aren't the true values of an organization. So I think that's part of the challenge around cultural change is, you know, we've got to make sure that whatever we're saying the values are, we have everything in place to support and reinforce those so that when we go to make a change, people aren't like, well, we never did anything with that anyway, or we say we value this, but we really don't show it. And so that could be a part of the problem with not getting buy-in from folks. So I think anyone who's contemplating, you know, initiating some type of culture change, you really have to make sure that you and your team, you understand the why. That's the first thing. Why are we doing this? And really, really believe in the why. Because if you don't believe it, it's going to be difficult trying to get someone else in the boat with you. And from that, we always have to think about what's in it for everyone else as well. And so if we can frame what we're thinking about and the changes we're thinking about, you know, in our head, how is this going to impact Stefan? How is this going to impact Adam? Jason, how is this going to impact you? That is going to help us. So really being able to understand the why, be close to that why, believe in that why, and then understand how it's going to impact other people. Then you bring in folks, but you got to have all of that worked out before you start bringing in people, or things just go awry. So really, really focusing on, you know, the why, understanding that, being committed to that, and then what's in it for everyone else, and being able to use that in your narrative to then go into bring other people into the room and the conversations around the changes that you're thinking about. Does that make sense?
Sure does.
Can I just add one really, really quick point to that? Because I think it's such an important point, which is, here's an example where I see this all the time. Like, people say we need to change the culture or the way that we interact and the way that we, you know, in a variety of different ways and systems, and then nothing in the evaluation process changes. Right? So if you're going to want to change and you're going to want new values or be animated with different types of behaviors, you've got to change your, you know, personal assessments and your evaluations of individuals. You got to put those values into, you got to be very explicit, like, tell us how you did X in this way, tell us how you did Y in that way. If it's not part of the evaluation system, then it's just going to be off on the side. And I think people forget about that all the time.
Yeah, I think that's right, Adam. And the other thing, I mean, Stefan talked about how they worked certain things into their bonus structure, which is great. Yeah. The other thing that I want us to think about too, when we talk about, you know, making sure that we're evaluating people, is not just around the bonus structure, but when you're talking about promoting people and that whole talent management process, these things need to come up in those discussions, right? And anytime you're having calibration meetings and discussing talent, you need to talk about those things that you say are most important to your organization when you're talking about moving someone within the organization.
Can I just say one last thing? Sorry, I'm so excited by all these ideas. I just want to just stress one last thing. I think Sonia said something really important about, like, what's in it for them. But here's the thing. Like I mentioned, this Nobel Prize winning economist, Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman and others, who basically showed that humans are much more motivated by what they might lose. And so just to give you one example, I have research showing that if you tell people, here's all the things that we gain from diversity, it doesn't move them. But if you tell them, here's all the things we're going to lose if we don't become more diverse, then they get on board. And so I think one of the things that people, they say, oh, culture is going to be good for you. It's going to be good for you. It's more effective to say, if we don't change, this is what we're going to lose.
Point. Stefan, I'm going to come to you because I know you've got some good stuff. I particularly like connecting back to, I loved the promised land and the desert. And I think sometimes we forget the power of symbolism, and sometimes it's thinking like a marketer too, right? Making it feel like something we want to be a part of. And so what advice would you add on to all of this for effectively leading culture change?
Yeah, before I get to that, I'd like to add, you know, on something that was said around the values. What was very interesting, and I think, you know, Adam, you mentioned that whilst we were evolving our culture, our value didn't change and haven't changed.
Right.
The passion for beauty, the innovation, the entrepreneurship, you know, people first. Those values have been, you know, with us for a very long time. Yet we've described, so it's a very valid point around, you know, changing the culture doesn't mean changing the values if they are the right ones for the organization. So if I now move to what type of advice, I think the what's in it for the people, and Adam, you're bringing an angle that is interesting. I never thought about it before. What people will lose. Certainly, people, in my experience, are very sensitive to, hey, you know, the big picture for the company. I get it, but what's in it for me? We know. Because people they're most interested about themselves first. But certainly you brought a very interesting angle about what they could lose. What I've seen, of course, working is when the leaders are, you know, obviously mirroring and behaving the way you want the new organization and the new culture to be. It's very interesting as when it works. What I've seen working as well is to be very explicit back again on what we're expecting on. This is what we're going to move from to, so that people understand, because behind some words, maybe sometimes the behavior can be different in my mind. So if I'm not being explicit about what I'm expecting you to do in those situations, when we talk about collaboration, what does that mean? So being explicit, and third piece for me would be having that network of influencers, champions, whatever you call them, in the organization that are your sort of sensors on, hey, we're getting off track here, or we're not, we're missing something. So that's yeah, those are the sort of points in the what I would do are key elements of success in my mind.
There was an interesting question from the audience posed about, sort of connecting back to what makes things challenging is that we, when we do have a strong culture, we tend to, that we hire for culture fit. So we hire people who are naturally inclined towards the strength of the existing culture, whether that's behaviorally in a positive sense or negatively when we're talking about inclusion and diversity. But I wonder, do you think about that when you think about culture change? Like what role does actually sometimes changing out people play in culture change? Like we always sort of approach this conversation as if the people we have is a constraint, but when you're a large organization, you have people coming and going and you have leaders coming and going. How much does the people change, and how do you think about that through a cultural change lens from HR? Because that's something we surely can affect. Sonia, I'll come to you.
Okay, great question. Absolutely. When you bring in people or when people leave, it's going to impact the culture in a positive way or a negative way. It's going to impact the overall organizational health in a positive way or a negative way. And so I think that's a very interesting question around when we are choosing talent. Are we choosing for the current culture or the future culture, right? So that's a really great question. I think it depends on where you are in the process, right? So if you're in the beginning of a shift in a culture change, everyone's not there yet. And so they're going to continue more than likely to continue to choose folks based on the existing culture. But, when you're in midstream of that shift or coming up towards the end of the shift completing, I think people have a little bit more understanding around the shift and will be looking to hire for future cultural needs as well as other operational needs, right? So I think it depends on where you are in the process.
Awesome. Stefan?
Yeah, I was gonna add, this is interesting, that notion of bringing different type of profiles, because naturally there's and I think Adam, you said that we're a product of habit. So of course, when I'm going to tell you I'm going to bring somebody different, that might be an add to the culture as opposed to a specific fit. The natural reaction might be rejection, and it's like when you ask who wants change, everybody is going to say, of course I want change. And then you ask the subsequent question, well, who wants to change? And then it's a different type of reaction. So I think it's, for me, it's a permanent effort to push that and to explain as to why. And I think, Sonia mentioned, depends what stage we're at. In our culture, certainly when we initiated the change, people ask, but why do we need to change? We've been successful for over 100 years. We're the leader in our industry, and no one is coming near. So why? And it also depends. So my response would be, it really depends as well. What is the organization able to digest, and what is the pace that you need to anticipate to push that change?
It's such an it's just one of those things. I think there's a really interesting, dimension there. And Adam, I'm sure you have thought about this or dug in, because I think that the most obvious place you see it is when you have like a CEO change, right? Because a CEO change often is an inherent cultural change. And then oftentimes, what does a new CEO do? They end up replacing half their team. Why? Because the people don't fit the new cultural change, and then it cascades down. And it seems like we're not having that conversation as often farther down as we do in the executive suite. But what lens does the people or that, how does that show up, whether it be selection processes or whatever, when you're consulting around culture change?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that there's another natural human tendency. There's a paper published in Nature, one of the top scientific journals in the world recently, where they just ask people, let's say you want to go from point A to point B, as an organization, as an individual, tell us what you do. And almost everyone wrote about what they would add, like some additional thing they would do. And almost no one wrote about what they would subtract, right? So we have this addition problem. And so, Stefan mentioned influencers, and I think they're really important, but as equally important are the resistors, right? And eliminating some of those resistors. So we sometimes, talk about CEOs changing their team, making dramatic changes. And I think that what I think people should do are surgical changes, right? Strategic ones, right? Figure out not only who the influencers are, but who are the resistors, because the resistors actually can have more damage than the influence can have a positivity. And it's just, there's true. I mean, research shows that the younger people in an organization, meaning the ones that have been in the culture for less amount of time, have an easier time adapting to change, right? It's just length of time is a really strong predictor. So bringing new people in the organization is one of the most effective ways to do that. It's part of the reason why universities are often the laboratory of change. We have an entire new organization every 4 years, right? When the students graduate, or in the business school every 2 years, we have an entirely new organization essentially, right? And so I think it is really important to think about personnel. And this is just the last thing I just want to say, which is everything we talked about, right? Values, and they may stay the same, exactly what Stefan said. L'Oreal's values are great, but the changes have to happen, but it's got to be systematic. We have to think who's coming in and who's leaving. We have to think about, what are the behaviors and practices, exactly what Sonia said, right? These defined practices within these systems, right? And then we also have to think about how we're evaluating people, right? How is that affecting our compensation systems, but even the words that we use, and then are we communicating effectively? So this is why I wanted to just again advocate for retreats, why retreats are so valuable. And if you structure the retreats in the right way, you can come out of them, and head towards victory. It's why I say values, voice, vision leads to victory for those reasons. And I think it becomes really important.
It's a really great idea to stick the what are we taking away, an addition bias. I hadn't ever thought of that. So that'll stick with me for a while.
It just came out last month. I was totally blown away by it when I saw this paper.
That is awesome. All right, so we have a couple of minutes left. I'll come to each of you for a final thought. Bonus points if your final thought has to do with how to influence reluctant or resistant executives who aren't on board with culture change. So who's game and ready to go? We got a minute and a half. You get 30 seconds each. Who's ready? Adam, I know you're ready.
I'll jump in and just say, the single biggest thing that you can do for any powerful person is always come to them with a solution, right? Always give them the simple thing they can do that will be easy for them and won't cost them a lot. And so I think, again, this idea of doing that, and sometimes, getting back to Sonia's point about behaviors, if you can get sometimes an executive to do a simple behavior, then their motivation will follow that, right? We know from research that sometimes getting just the behavior is enough to get the motivation to follow. And so I think that's one thing that I would say.
Awesome. Thank you. Stefan.
I would say the same way you ask every individual and you look at every individual and what's in it for them, there's also that same narrative that applies to the leader. But unfortunately, I have to say with my experience, there are some leaders that won't get on board with change, and you have to accept that.
Sonia, you got the first word and the last word.
All right. Just to piggyback off of what's already been said, with the folks who struggle getting on board, more than likely they will self-select out, because if you are, asking folks to change their behavior and they are unwilling, more than likely they are not going to continue to be successful in their role. And so they self-select out. And so allowing folks to keep their dignity when they're doing that is really, really important as well.
Awesome. Thank you all. You were amazing. This was fun. I could do this for another hour, but I suppose we got to get on with things. So thank you all so much. Appreciate each of you participating and sharing. And we are literally at the very, very